for you.
So, I'm Dr. Ioannis Kokkinidis of the Fresno 151 chapter, and thank you for coming today in this Golden Gate AHEPA District 21 lecture by Christine Philliou and Mr. Sokratis Sourvinos, our counselor in San Francisco. First, we will have a small video by the President of the Hellenic Republic, Mrs. Ekaterini Sakelaropoulou. Our two speakers today. Our first speaker is Mrs. Christine Philliou, who was not able to make it but has left us a video. She is the Associate Professor at UC Berkeley's Department of History. She specializes in the political and social history of the Ottoman Empire, modern Turkey, and Greece as part of the post-Ottoman world. Her book, Biography of an Empire, Governing Ottomans in an Age of Revolution, examines the changes in Ottoman governance leading up to the Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century. It does so using the vantage point of Phanarios, an Orthodox Christian elite that was intimately involved in the day-to-day work of governance, even though structurally excluded from the Ottoman state. Her current work turns to the political, personal, and intellectual artistic itinerary of the Turkish writer Refik Halit Karay. Her interest in other publications have had to do with comparative empires across Eurasia, various levels of transitions from an Ottoman to a post-Ottoman world in the 19th and 20th century, and political and cultural interfaces in the Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, and Balkans in the early modern and modern eras. This policy is teaching a seminar. Policy is teaching a seminar on the post-Ottoman world, and next semester graduate seminar on comparative empires, the Ottoman Empire and its rivals. Our second speaker is the Counselor of Greece to San Francisco, Mr. Sokratis Sourvinos, who, like me, is from Piraeus. He is a seasoned career diplomat, recently arrived at his new position here in San Francisco. Prior to this, he was in Dubai at the Embassy of Greece of the United Arab Emirates, Deputy Head of Mission and Head of the Consular Office between 2018 and 2020. In his words, after a few weeks in California, I am amazed by the local diaspora's quality and talent. I am proud of their collective and individual accomplishments, and I am confident that our joint efforts will contribute to responding to the current challenges. Mr. Sourvinos, after she graduated from the National Kapodistrian University of Athens and the Bachelor of Arts, and from the Democritus University of Thrace with a degree in an LLM in International Studies, continues to study at Tufts University Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy for his MA, and the Harvard Kennedy School in Negotiation and Diplomacy. He has been awarded the Cross of the Apostle Marcus from the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria and all Africa, and he is fluent in Greek, Spanish, French, and English. With that, I will turn it over to our brother to start the videos, to our brother President of the Governor of District 21 to start the videos.
Αγαπητοί μου συμπατριώτες, Ελληνίδες και Έλληνες του εξωτερικού, το μήνυμα που σας μεταφέρω αυτή τη χρονιά, με αφορμή την επέτειο της 25ης Μαρτίου, ενέχει ιδιαίτερο συμβολισμό, καθώς εορτάζουμε τα 200 χρόνια από την έναρξη της Επανάστασης που οδήγησε στην αποτείναξη του Οθωμανικού ζυγού, στην απελευθέρωση της πατρίδας και στη δημιουργία του σύγχρονου ελληνικού κράτους. Σε αυτή την ιστορική συγκυρία, ξεχωριστή θέση στη συλλογική μας μνήμη κατέχουν οι Έλληνες της Διασποράς, που με αυταπάρνηση και ανιδιοτελή προσφορά συνέβαλαν στην αφύπνιση της ελληνικής εθνικής συνείδησης και στην προετοιμασία του αγώνα, στηρίζοντας με κάθε τρόπο και μέσο τον ιερό αυτό σκοπό. Η εκτέλεση από τους Τούρκους του εθνομάρτυρα και ευρωπαϊστή Ρήγα εντείνει τις προσπάθειες συστηματικότερης οργάνωσης των Ελλήνων του εξωτερικού. Στις ελληνικές παροικίες της Δυτικής Ευρώπης, Έλληνες διανοούμενοι, σε επαφή με τα πολιτιστικά ρεύματα της εποχής, διεθνοποιούν το ελληνικό ζήτημα και διαδίδουν την ιδέα του νεοελληνικού έθνους, που έχει δικαίωμα σε χωριστή πολιτική ύπαρξη. Στο Παρίσι ιδρύεται το ελληνόγλωσσο ξενοδοχείο και στη Βιέννη η Φιλόμουσος εταιρεία, δύο από τις προδρομικές οργανώσεις της φιλικής εταιρείας. Στη Βιέννη επίσης εκδίδεται η πρώτη ελληνική εφημερίδα «Εφημερίς», που έχει μεγάλη απήχηση και μεταφέρει τις ιδέες του νεοελληνικού διαφωτισμού, μέσα στον οποίο εκολάπτεται η ιδεολογική μαγιά της προεπαναστατικής περίοδου. Λόγοι οι κληρικοί, όπως ο άνθιμος Γαζής και ο νεόφυτος Δούκας, καθιστούν την πόλη αυτή το μεγαλύτερο πνευματικό κέντρο διάδοσης των ευρωπαϊκών ιδεών στην Ελλάδα, ενώ η οικονομική ανάπτυξη ελληνικών εμπορικών εταιριών ευνοεί τη χρηματοδότηση ελληνόγλωσσων σχολείων. Ανάλογη δραστηριότητα συναντάται και σε άλλα μέρη της κεντρικής Ευρώπης. Έλληνες που καταφέρουν να διαφύγουν από την Κύπρο, τη Σμύρνη, τη Ρόδο, την Ήπειρο, από τη σφαγή της Χίου και άλλα μέρη της Ελλάδας, βρίσκουν καταφύγιο στη Μασσαλία και στην Τεργέστη, ενώ οι ελληνικές κοινότητες στην Αγκώνα και στο Λιβόρνο χρηματοδοτούν αποστολές, παρέχοντας στους ήρωες του 21 όπλα, πολεμοφόδια και τρόφιμα. Και είναι μεγάλος ο αριθμός των Ελλήνων της Διασποράς που πολέμησαν και έδωσαν τη ζωή τους για την ανεξαρτησία της χώρας μας, μαχόμενοι μαζί με τους εξεγερμένους αδελφούς υπερπίστεως και πατρίδος. 2 αιώνες μετά την Επανάσταση, ο άσβεστος πόθος για ελευθερία που μας εμφύσισαν οι αγωνιστές της, η αγάπη τους για την πατρίδα και η απαράμιλη αυτοθυσία τους αποτελούν την πυξίδα με την οποία καλούμαστε να πορευθούμε σε ένα γεωπολιτικό περιβάλλον με διαρκείς εντάσεις. Η Ελλάδα αποτελεί ισχυρό κράτος δικαίου, στον πυρήνα της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης και σταθερό παράγοντα ειρήνης στην Ανατολική Μεσόγειο και στην ευρύτερη περιοχή. Η χώρα μας ενδυναμώνει τις συμμαχίες της, προφυλάσσει αποτελεσματικά τα σύνορά της και απαντά αποφασιστικά στην τουρκική επιθετικότητα, με γνώμονα την πιστή εφαρμογή των αρχών του διεθνούς δικαίου. Και αν η εθνική μας ανεξαρτησία θεωρείται σήμερα αδιαμφισβήτητη, το ίδιο αδιαμφισβήτητη παραμένει η προσήλωσή μας στην προάσπιση των εθνικών και κυριαρχικών μας δικαιωμάτων και η θωράκιση της ασφάλειάς μας. Αγαπητοί μου συμπατριώτες, η κρίση του κορονοϊού που δοκιμάζει εδώ και 1 χρόνο τον πλανήτη ολόκληρο δεν μας επιτρέπει να προσδώσουμε στους επετειακούς εορτασμούς για τη συμπλήρωση 2 αιώνων από την εθνική μας επανάσταση τη λαμπρότητα που της αρμόζει. Αυτό όμως δεν μας εμποδίζει να νιώθουμε περήφανοι για όλα όσα έχουμε πετύχει μέχρι σήμερα και αισιόδοξοι για όσα πρέπει να δημιουργήσουμε αύριο. Όλοι εσείς, Έλληνες πρώτης, δεύτερης και τρίτης γενιάς, που ζείτε στο εξωτερικό, χωρίς ούτε στιγμή να λησμονείτε την Ελλάδα, που προκόβετε σε τόπους μακρινούς και αντιμετωπίζετε τις σύγχρονες προκλήσεις, είστε άξιοι πρεσβευτές του ελληνισμού σε όλο τον κόσμο. Και το παράδειγμά σας αποτελεί λαμπρή δικαίωση εκείνων που το 1821 αγωνίστηκαν με ηρωισμό για να είμαστε εμείς σήμερα ελεύθεροι. Χρόνια πολλά.
Hello, and greetings from the new Modern Greek and Hellenic Studies program at Berkeley to everyone in the AHEPA family and community. I'm sorry I cannot be with you live in this virtual event, but it's an honor to be able to address you on the occasion of the bicentennial of the outbreak of the Greek Revolution and to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Project for Greek Statehood. As a second-generation Greek American and as the daughter and niece of AHEPans, I share your pride at Greece's achievement and applaud the tenacity and determination of Greeks throughout history to preserve Greek language and culture and to foster the appreciation for the values of democracy, including the openness to debate and to disagreement, values the whole world needs to reinforce in our present moment. As a fellow Greek American, I share your pride on the occasion of this bicentennial anniversary. I grew up in Boston hearing stories about my ancestors, Greeks from Macedonia and Asia Minor and Constantinople, as well as stories about my relatives still living in Greece today, relatives I always love to visit and love to stay in touch with. I lived in Greece for years after college, and Greece has provided me with a home and a base in the world, which I'm very grateful for. I'm also a fellow member of the diaspora, following and supporting Greece from afar, alongside the AHEPA family. So, as a Greek American, I applaud and commemorate. As a historian and scholar, my job is to disturb, or at least unsettle our assumptions a bit, and get us to think a little differently about ourselves and our history. So that I will do for a few minutes today, if nothing else than as an exercise in democracy and critical thinking. The Greek Revolution began on a day like today 200 years ago. It started in the Danubian Principality of Moldavia, and the conflict quickly moved to the Peloponnese and the southern mainland of Greece. Political visionaries, intellectuals, merchants, military leaders, rank-and-file clerics, and fighters joined forces against a beleaguered and ramshackle Ottoman military for a protracted war. The conflict would never have happened without the Greeks in Odessa and in Europe, merchants who had amassed the ideas and the financial and military resources to launch this rather quixotic project. Indeed, no one else had even tried to secede from the Ottoman domains on anything resembling a national basis before. What is sometimes called the Serbian Revolution, the previous decade, had been more of a local revolt against the excesses of the Ottoman Janissaries in Belgrade, with the goal of renegotiating Serbia's relationship to the Ottoman government, not severing ties with it. No, this Greek Revolution was like nothing anyone had seen before, coordinated with actors both inside and outside of the empire taking part. And indeed, perhaps because it was because of its novelty that the Ottoman government, the Sultan and his viziers, had no idea what it was, where it came from, or how to respond to it. They were caught completely unawares, sleeping, as people like to say at the time. They lashed out, hanging the patriarch in April 1821 on Easter Sunday no less, ordering massacres such as that on Chios and Psara and the town of Aivali on the coast of Asia Minor, and looking the other way as individual reprisal killings of innocents who happened to have been Greek Orthodox in the capital and the cities of Asia Minor took place. The Greek Revolution even prompted them to take the step for the first time of attempting population counts of Greeks and others resident in their realms, since they did not even know who they had authority over, let alone how to police them. Such was the state of the empire in 1821. And the Greek revolutionaries fought on through 1821 and 1822 and 1823 in a long stalemate, even as Europe watched, reluctant to get involved in a revolutionary movement that might disturb their status quo. And they fought on, even when the formidable naval forces of Mehmet Ali Pasha of Egypt, although himself a native of Kavala and actually an Albanian, but that's another story, these naval forces were called in to take over the Ottoman war effort. Mehmet Ali, also known as the Napoleon of Egypt, took power there in the wake of the original Napoleon's retreat and enacted many of the same reforms in the military that he had learned from Napoleon's forces. Even with his modern army, which later became the model for Ottoman military reforms back in the center of the empire, the Greek rebels could not and would not be defeated. The stalemate was broken in 1827 in the Battle of Navarino, when the great powers entered the conflict on the side of the Greek rebels, a true turning point in the history of the revolution and in the history of Hellenism, a turning point without which there might not have been established a Greek state at all. From that point on, the battle shifted from the battlefield to the negotiating table. And there, too, the Greeks fought long and hard for independence rather than autonomy, which would have been the preferred solution of Russia, for the borders of the original Greek state, and to carve out a space of modern statehood for Greece, for the first time in the history of the Ottoman Empire, and indeed for the first time in history. The Greek Revolution and the secession of Greece from the empire was in fact the beginning of the end of the empire. The unraveling would of course take another century, and Greece stood by and evolved as a state as the Ottoman Empire devolved as a state. Greek revolutionaries fighting for a state of their own ushered in so many beginnings and endings in the Ottoman Empire, in Europe, and in the relationship between the two, in the history of nation-state formation, and in the making of the modern Balkans and the Middle East. They also ushered in a new phase in the history of Hellenism. Because alongside and encompassing this history of the struggle for and achievement of Greek statehood is, of course, the broader history and culture of Hellenism, of which we are all a part, a history which continues with us today in the diaspora. As a Greek growing up outside of Greece, I was always curious about this moment when Greece achieved independence, and of what it must have meant for Greeks at the time who were not living in the Greek state, since my ancestors never did. I turned my attention to Greeks of the Ottoman Empire, particularly Constantinople, and spent many years studying the families and households of the Phanar, associated with the ecumenical patriarchate and as functionaries of the High Ottoman state. These families, as you know, called themselves Phanariotes, Phanariotes, and we sometimes refer to them as an empire within an empire, Byzance après Byzance, Byzantium after Byzantium, for the power they wielded within the Ottoman Empire, where in fact they had no guarantee of political or legal equality, and were in fact treated more often as second-class citizens. Some of these Phanariots, of course, worked with and joined wholeheartedly the movement for Greek independence, such as Alexander Ypsilantis himself, the Mavrocordatos and Negris families, and so many others. Some, however, remained in Constantinople, working behind the scenes for the Ottoman Foreign Ministry, and this is where the disturbing happens, the Ottoman Foreign Ministry as it took shape in the 1840s and after, and even representing the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman interests at negotiations such as the all-important Congress of Berlin in 1878, where Alexandros Karatheodoris represented the Ottomans. Phanariots, of course, have a complicated, and understandably, have a complicated reputation in and a relationship to Greek national history and, and to the Greek War of Independence. They are both venerated as those who helped bring Enlightenment ideas to the Hellenic world, and they are shunned for their willingness to cooperate with the Ottoman government. Greece never managed to encompass Constantinople, of course, and many of us are here today in America because of the conflicts that ensued in the course of those efforts. My grandparents came over in 1913 from Macedonia and 1920 from Constantinople. We, as Greek Orthodox in the United States, are under the authority of the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople, of course, rather than that of the Church of Greece, the Archbishop of Greece. So this broader and complex history of Hellenism is still very relevant for us today. We both celebrate Greek statehood and continue to be tied to Constantinople, even as we live our lives in the United States. I offer you today these multiple perspectives on Hellenism, from America, from Constantinople, and from the Peloponnese, not to detract from the achievement of Greek statehood, which was truly remarkable and heroic at the time, and which remains remarkable today when we look back on it. I offer these perspectives to allow us to bring into even sharper relief just how remarkable that achievement was, particularly within the larger world of Hellenism then and now. Greeks, whether in Mesolongi, Athens, or Constantinople, struggled and continue to struggle for a voice of their own. We need only look at the struggle going on right now among the few remaining Greeks and the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. Phanariots were enacting their own struggle and managed to prosper under a government that was not their own, where they were guaranteed nothing. Likewise, Greeks, no matter where we are, in Greece or in the diaspora, have that in common, the will and the tenacity to struggle and to prosper, even under adverse circumstances, and often especially under adverse circumstances. 1821 then symbolizes the victory and achievement of independent statehood for Greece, and the turning point in a much longer and even richer story of struggle and achievement for Hellenism, which continues today wherever we are. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to have the chance to speak with you all live in the future.
Hello to everyone. Good morning, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's a great opportunity for us to discuss a little bit about the Greek Revolution. Actually, these days we're celebrating the bicentennial anniversary of the 1821 saga, an event that sparked the process that led to the creation of the modern Greek state. I am not a historian, so I will try to provide an overview of the revolution of 1821. I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion, and I would prefer that I have some questions from the part of John, so that we somehow start a quite interesting exchange of views. Thank you.
Oh, yes. So, Mr. Counselor, can you describe the general situation in Europe and beyond during the initial period of the Greek Revolution?
Yes. If we try to get a bird's eye view of what was happening back then, the first events that we should mention are first the footprint of the European Enlightenment, a movement that was highly influenced by the classic ideas and ideals of Greece, of ancient Greece, and that highlighted the value of liberty, tolerance, freedom, and democracy. At the same time, this movement was coupled with a certain artistic currents at the time. We're talking about the Romanticism and the Classicism, which were also influenced by the ideals of the ancient Greece. They were everywhere in the art world. Poetry, sculpture, painting, architecture, everything was influenced by these ideas. At the same point, we should say that some serious events that happened before that were, first, the American Revolution and also the French Revolution. These events proved that the rulers of the time can be challenged. So this somehow encouraged certain people that wanted to struggle for something better. After the two revolutions that I've mentioned, we had the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleonic Wars who spread turmoil in Europe. And as a reaction to these events, the great powers of the time decided that they had to do something in order to stop these dangerous ideas. Eventually, through the creation of the Holy Alliance and also through the Vienna Congress, the Congress of Vienna back in 1815, they decided that they should establish a very conservative order. The status quo should not be undermined under any cost. The leitmotif was no more revolutions. So eventually that was the setting in Europe back then. Some minor uprisings in Italy or in Spain at the beginning of the Greek Revolution were considered some sort of misfortunes that could be easily addressed by the empires that were controlling these territories, and the others should not interfere. So they considered that more or less these were very easy problems to resolve, but that was not the case for the Greek case.
Do you have any comments on the beginning of the revolution and the role of the diaspora?
Yes, as I said before, the influence of the current in the cultural and ideological field, like the Classicism, Romanticism, and the European Enlightenment was huge. So what happened is that they somehow prepared the fertile ground for what was about to follow with the Greek Revolution. The Greek diaspora, the Greeks that were living abroad, were very successful business people. Most of them were merchants, some of them scholars, bankers, and some others were fleet owners. They were mainly based in trade hubs, international trade hubs in the Western Europe, like Vienna, like Paris, Venice, Odessa. And from there, they were trying to prepare their brothers that were living within the borders of the Ottoman Empire. So they focused in certain priorities. They highly encouraged the Greek youths that were living in the Ottoman Empire to acquire quality education that would be based on the Greek language, which was also a component of vital importance. And at the same time, they were sending books. They were trying to pass the ideals and the freedom principles that were all over Europe to the Greeks and the Ottoman Empire. We have some huge figures like Rigas Fereos or Adamantios Korais, who influenced heavily what was happening in Greece, but also in Europe at the same time, and they had some sort of interactions with highly influential figures from abroad.
What was the initial objective of the uprising?
Okay, the initial objective, we can say that it was very vague. It was quite abstract. If we start examining what the Philliou, a diaspora organization that tried to spark the fire of the revolution, were trying to do, they said that we're trying to revive the Byzantine Empire, Byzantium. Very abstract, very ambitious goal. At the same time, they were talking about freeing all Greeks. It wasn't easy to define Greeks back then. But what we can say right now was that there is some sort of implied independence as a goal. From the point of territorial claims, we didn't have something specific. We were talking about the liberation of all the Greeks. So if we examine first the perspective of independence, as Professor Philliou said, that was something totally different from anything that had happened before. We examined the Serbian case, and the Serbians, what they wanted was some sort of higher privileges, some sort of a superior autonomy, but always under the control of the Ottomans. With the Greek Revolution, all we wanted was independence. So it was a rather vague cause, but at the same time, the definition of the Greeks as the Philliou wanted the liberation of all of them was rather problematic, because in the Ottoman Empire, the division of the population was based on religious criteria. So we were having the Orthodox Christians, and then again, something that differentiated the Greeks was also the use of their language. But sometimes we can say that if Syllabis, when he started his campaign from up north, he considered that the Orthodox were all Greeks. Unfortunately, he learned a very bitter lesson, because the population that he tried to encourage to fight along him on the northern part, in the Danubian principalities, were Orthodox, but they were not really Greeks, and that somehow condemned him to failure. These were the parts, yes.
What was the role of the Hellenic movement?
The help from abroad was extremely important for the success of the revolution. The diaspora, as well as the members of this movement, offered a huge assistance to the Greek cause. The Philhellenic movement was first highly influenced by the cultural traits of this era. Classicism, once again, Romanticism, as well as the European Enlightenment, was paving the way for the acceptance of the Greek cause. The Philhellenic movement somehow framed the Greek struggle as the struggle of the heirs of the ancient Greek nobility against their barbarian oppressors. And at the same time, these heirs of the ancient Greeks were also Christians, and they were fighting against Muslims. So it was something that was very easy to swallow for the public opinion. Public opinion that globally was 100% positive for the Greek cause. Of course, the ones that were the members of the Philhellenic movement back then were, we could say that in today's terms, they were opinion leaders. They were highly influential personalities, members of elites, very well educated, some of them artists, like Lord Byron, from the Great Britain, like Delacroix from France, Victor Hugo from France, Pushkin from Russia, Howe and Allen from the US, and all they could do was to heavily influence on their public opinion. At the same time, the newspapers of this era were highly positive to the Greek cause. The Philhellenes were sending resources, they were sending weapons, they were sending books, and some of them were courageous enough to fight alongside the Greeks. In order to get the general picture, it would be useful to transpose what was happening then with the Philhellenes in today's general measures. Let's say that we have Lord Byron, who was probably the most influential, most famous poet in Great Britain back then. What he did, leaving everything behind and going to fight alongside Greeks, we could say that it could have some sort of analogies with a huge Hollywood star leaving behind everything he has right now and going to fight with a guerrilla movement somewhere in the world. That had a huge impact in the public opinion of the time. At the same, if we also try to examine what was happening with the painters or the artists of the era, we should take into account that there was no media back then, like the media that we have now. We had no picture, we had no video. So eventually when Delacroix painted in huge detail the slaughter of Chios, it also created quite a fuss for the public opinion of the time, who actually saw with their own eyes what was happening back in Greece.
Which factors were of vital importance for the Greek uprising?
Okay, one could support that there were a lot of factors that played a serious role in the success of the Greek uprising, or even in the manifestation of the Greek uprising. But if we have to take one, I would say that the thing that really differentiated the Greeks from the other populations that lived within the borders of the Ottoman Empire was the fact that the Greeks had already started to forge a national identity. A national identity that was based in two crucial elements. First, the Greek language, but also the Orthodox tradition. These two elements were getting progress, and they were spread around the population through the vehicle of education. And what we can say here is that the Greeks had the highest education among the other populations in the Ottoman Empire. The fact that they were encouraged by the diaspora to invest in this field was very successful. So eventually they were the ones that were highly educated. Their language was the lingua franca of the Balkans, and at the same time the language was the language that was used during the services in the churches, and it was also the language of the Iera Evangelia, the holy books of the Orthodoxy. That led us first to the creation of certain elites within the Ottoman Empire. We listened to Professor Philliou talking about the Fanariotes, which played a serious role, but at the same time the Greeks thought that they're not exactly like the rest of the population within the Ottoman Empire. They thought there was something different. They're not second-class citizens, but they can fight for something more. And that's what was the foundation for the revolution, in my opinion.
Please describe the situation during the first year of the revolution.
Okay, in order to comprehend what was going on in the territory that is today the Greek state, we should start taking into account the fact that the Ottoman Empire was a huge territory very difficult to control. The Ottoman Empire was facing serious troubles. It was not in good shape as it used to be centuries ago. Their administrative tasks could not be taken care properly. Sometimes they were outsourcing these tasks to Greeks, prominent Greeks, primates, the proesti as they were called, who were collecting taxes on behalf of the Sultan, and at the same time they were taking care of everyday administrative tasks. The army at the same time of the Ottomans was a huge army, but it wasn't properly trained. The methods were starting to change back then, and the Ottomans didn't follow them. Of course, at the same time, Balkans was a region that was extremely dangerous to be visited by a foreigner. The Balkans, in particular Greece, was a place that was infested by bandits, the well-known klephtes, who were dangerous to everyone, and they were a threat to people and merchandise alike. The rivals were the Armatoli, paid militias that were there in order to protect persons, to protect merchandise, cities, and convoys. What is crucial to understand here is that no matter if we have Klephtes and Armatoli, and sometimes the identity of the Klephtes is not very concrete, because if someone else pays him better, he will become an Armatolos and vice versa. What is crucial is that we have in the creation of a certain caste, a certain group of people that are professional fighters, and they get to know how to use weapons, they get to know how to wage guerrilla war, and on top of that, they are the total masters of their territory. They really know the very difficult geography of the Greek land back then, which is quite difficult land with a lot of slippery slopes, steep slopes, dense flora, rivers, and narrow passages. And this gives them a huge advantage when they started the guerrilla warfare. At the same time, this was not a great setting for a conventional and untrained army like the Ottoman army. Moreover, we had a very competent fleet. A very competent fleet that was based on our capacity to be in contact with the sea, on the dexterity as well of the Greek merchants, and the fact that they were improvising and they were able to cut off the supply lines of the Ottomans, particularly in Peloponnese, in Moryas. So all these things combined with the heroic spirit and the soul of the Greek nation, as well as the strategic ingenuity of leaders like Kolokotronis, were the factors that helped us get the huge successes of the first years of the revolution.
Do you have any comments regarding disagreements within the Greek camp after the first couple of years of the revolution?
Well, in a nutshell, yes, we were having huge disagreements. Everyone knows that. They were serious, of course. They were also expected, and I will try to elaborate on that. And finally, the good thing was that, fortunately, all these disagreements and disputes did not undermine the Greek uprising to the point of failure. If we have to examine in more detail these disagreements, we should say that they were very serious and on three different levels. We were having disagreements between the locals and the outsiders. The local leaders were extremely reluctant to cede their authority to someone who was considered a public figure like Ypsilantis, who went to Moryas and give their privileges to them, as well as to Capodicias. We saw exactly what happened when he came in order to take the lead of the Greek state. This was also a phenomenon when we had the central government of Greece, when Greece was a new modern state, and even then the local authority were still very reluctant to the new style of governance. The second level of disagreements was the well-known dispute between the militaries and the politicians. The well-known argument was that the members of the army just risked their lives in the battlefield, and then you had the politicians that tried to take over, and that was not easily accepted, as anyone can imagine. We saw that unfolding with the story of Kolokotronis. And then finally we had the third level, which was the three parties that were siding the three great powers, France, Great Britain, and Russia. And their enmity continued during the first decades of the life of the newly formed Greek kingdom. And actually, it was another source of dispute. Now, if it was expected, one should face the fact that it was the very first time through the Greek Revolution of 1821 that we attempted to create a homogeneous common Greek state. Before that, we were having the city-states in the antiquity that were always quarreling among them. We were having Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Macedonia. They were tiny states with internal disputes, one would say. Then we had Byzantium. Byzantium was a huge empire that was not exclusively inhabited by Greeks. So eventually, what was about to happen was to create a new state that would have Greeks as their sole population. That was a huge feat by itself. So eventually, any kind of disagreements, disputes, and problems were more or less expected. Finally, one would say that our race more or less has this sort of quarrels, but eventually they become constructive. We cannot say that in the beginning of the revolution we had any problems, but then I think that this sort of problems led us to something better. It took us a while, but still I can say that we're fortunate enough that the revolution succeeded, even though we had enmity between different factions.
Can you explain the positions of the great powers regarding the Greek struggle?
Okay, if we are about to generally examine what every player of the game was supporting, we can say in a nutshell that Great Britain was reluctant at first to intervene or to take positions. That changed after 1823 when George Canning was appointed as foreign secretary and later prime minister. He was more liberal and he was more positive to the Greek cause. At the same time, the British were considering that the Ottoman Empire is the fence, is the obstacle against any potential exit of Russia to the Mediterranean. So they somehow tried to delay or to avoid the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, in the outlook of the British, the eastern trade routes played a role. So they have to maintain a certain balance of powers so that they maintain the monopoly or at least they maintain a certain advantage in their access to the eastern routes. Then Russia. Russia was the exact opposite. They were the natural protectors of the Orthodox population within the Ottoman Empire. They were the ones that were in constant rivalry with the Ottomans because the Ottomans were guarding the straits and the Russians wanted to have exit to the warm sea of the Mediterranean. At the same time, the tactics of the Russians were very specific. They were always opting for the fragmentation of the Ottoman territory in tiny, weak states that could have a certain degree of autonomy under the control officially of the port of the Sultan, but at the same time under the sphere of influence of Moscow. And that was what they were trying to do when they suggested that Greece is separated in three different sectors, autonomous, under the control of the Sultan, but at the same time they knew that that was a great way to control what was going on in the Balkan Peninsula. Then we're having the French. The French were somewhere between the Great Britain and Russia. They wanted to reinstate their global position right after the defeat in the Napoleonic Wars. So they were trying to exploit any kind of opportunity that could come up. They were trying to be more versatile than the rest. They always have, the French always have a certain Mediterranean dimension in their diplomacy, so that was apparent even at these times. Moreover, the Ottoman Empire, I haven't got a lot of things to add about them. They were called the sick man of Europe. They were close to reaching the point of disintegration. And as we said before, some of the players in Europe were trying to delay it in order to take the proper positions for the day after. And then we were having Austria, which was a power that really wanted to maintain the Congress of Vienna status quo. They wanted no more revolutions, they wanted stability at any cost, and Chancellor Metternich was one of the greatest enemies of the Greek cause for these reasons.
How would you describe the stance of the United States? Also, one of the speakers mentions a fundraiser Greek ball held in New York City on February 1827 to support the last years of the Greek War.
Mm-hmm. So actually, we have to understand that the U.S. back then was not the superpower that we have now. It was a very young state that tried to bolster its position internationally, and a state that tried to maneuver into some very complicated events that took place globally. Of course, one could say that America was the first international party to acknowledge the Greek cause, but at the same time, through the Monroe Doctrine, the Americans opted for some sort of isolationism, concentrating on what was going on in the American continent, and they preferred not to meddle with the European affairs and what was going on in Greece, because this choice could have backfired. Of course, that was not the case with the public opinion. Contrary to what was happening with the government, the public opinion in the States was extremely positive to the Greek cause. The Philharmonic Movement was very strong. We were having city committees in New York, in Washington, in Philadelphia, and a lot of other smaller cities that were gathering humanitarian aids, that were gathering weapons, and of course they were gathering public support for the Greeks. Another thing that we should take into account is the direct link between the American Revolution and the Greek Revolution. The American Revolution was inspired by the ideals of ancient Greece, and then the Greek Revolution was also inspired by the heritage that the American Revolution left. So it was some sort of an ambidirectional relation between the two. The Americans considered, as we said before, the Greeks as the heirs of the antiquity, the famous Greek antiquity. And at the same time, there was another spin that was linking the Greek struggle to the abolitionist movement. The Greek slaves fighting for the freedom, while the black slaves were also fighting for the freedom. Finally, another aspect that we should take into account is that the Greek struggle was always one of the main stories of the newspapers back at the time. And all over the US, the newspapers were covering what was happening in Greece, and it was one of the very hot issues back at this era. So I would say that the great relations between the two people started from day one for the States. And even though it wasn't based on governmental actions, the support that we got from the public opinion was more than enough.
Which was the defining victory for the outcome of the Greek Revolution?
Okay, if we try to approach this issue from a military point of view. Without a doubt, the Battle of Navarino was the most important battle in the revolution. It was the end game of the attempts of the Ottomans to suppress the Greek uprising. At the same time, though, if we get the bigger picture, it would be impossible for the Greeks to get an all-out win to the Ottomans. The Greeks were extremely courageous, extremely competent, but they were nothing but than a bunch of people against a huge empire. A huge empire with a very powerful, even though outdated army, and a lot of resources. So I would say that the biggest success of the Greek side was the fact that even at the hardest juncture of the revolutions, the Greeks were never completely defeated. Even when they were outnumbered, even when they didn't have the best weapons, they kept on fighting. They regrouped under different compositions, different formations, different leaderships, different locations. They kept on fighting, and that was really heroic. And they reached a point where they kept on going on for so long that the European great powers could not afford to ignore the Greek cause any longer. So eventually this led us to the internationalization of the Greek question. And the Europeans thought that they cannot but start thinking if they could have a different solution than leaving the Ottomans address this issue, because their interests were at stake. And this led us to some diplomatic negotiations that eventually paved the way for the Battle of Navarino, because we had the joint fleets of the French, the Russians, and the British that wanted to impose the ceasefire that was decided by the great powers between the Greeks and the Ottomans. At the same time, the Ottomans had a newly built fleet with the Egyptians, and their joint fleet was heading to Hydra in order to destroy completely the Hydrian fleet. That was always a nuisance for them. The Europeans could not let that happen. So eventually we have hundreds of ships that get to meet right close to Navarino. We don't really know what happened there. Some say that we reached a point where a storm was about to break out, so the Europeans had to be harbored in Navarino, along with the joint fleet of the Egyptians and the Ottomans. So we're talking about a very limited surface with a huge number of fleets, at least for the beginning of 19th century. Some say that a boat tried to coordinate the harboring of the British frigates. Eventually someone was not patient enough and fired the first gunshot. And after that, chaos ensued. In 4 hours, the Egyptian and Ottoman fleet was utterly destroyed. They had 6,000 sailors dead, and the rest is history. That paved the way for the creation of the Greek modern state.
What was the impact of the Greek Revolution on the European order?
Well, the Greek Revolution was a change of paradigm. One can say that before the Greek uprising, we were having some changes in the control of territories, but was not nothing more than territorial reshufflement between grounds that were controlled by big empires, by the empires of the time. What happened with Greece, though, was the fact that a tiny part of the Ottoman Empire became independent. Even though it was small, it meant that we have a fragmentation of one of the big empires of the time. And that inspired a lot of other populations to do the same. And that started the era of revolutions, a chain of nationalistic uprisings that took place all over the European continent. I think that that was the importance of the Greek struggle. It was the very first independent nationalistic state that was created in Europe.
That's the last question I have. Does anyone else have a question for the chat that I can pass on? I am not seeing any questions, so I'll pass on to our district governor, Mr. Malas.
I have one question. Hello?
Yes. Dr. John Laius from Reno.
I have a question. You mentioned that the Greeks were very well educated. Where and how did they get their education when they were under the influence of the Ottoman Empire?
Yes. Well, there is the impression that in general there were a lot of problems with education back then. The thing is that the Ottomans didn't care about it. They neglected this pedagogy. And that's why the Greeks had the opportunity to become part of the elite. So we always hear in the stories about the hidden schools and all these trends. It's true that the education was a part of the religious education. But there was no serious problem because of the religious liberty were more or less protected or at least tolerated to a certain extent by the Ottomans. The problem was when they started talking about national identity. That was something that the Ottomans didn't want to hear about. But within the churches and within the nations of the diaspora, schools, formal but still existing, were functioning back then. And they were mainly focused in religious education. However, religious education, as we said, was a part of the national identity, and the fact that they were talking Greek was something very difficult to control from the Ottomans.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Councillor, for your time. I think with this we will close down our lecture today. Our next lecture is going to be in a couple of weeks. Thank you for your time, everyone. And